What I'm about to tell you has been deliberately buried for over a century. In the spring of 1889, in the respectable drawing rooms of Mayfair, London, a single whispered confession from a housemaid named Elizabeth Mortimer brought down one of Britain's most decorated military families. The documents I've uncovered, court transcripts, private letters, asylum records, paint a picture so disturbing that 3 generations worked to erase it from history. Colonel Robert Ashworth-Kent returned from the Second Afghan War a hero. By the summer of 1889, he would die in disgrace, his name struck from military records, his portrait removed from the United Service Club, his medals returned to the War Office in an unmarked box. This is the story they never wanted you to hear. Before we begin this descent into one of Victorian England's darkest scandals, I need you to do something. Subscribe to Whispers of Mystery right now. What you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about Britain's imperial legacy. Hit that subscribe button because the evidence I'm presenting today has never been compiled in this format before. The families involved still exist, the properties still stand, and the truth has been waiting in archive boxes for someone to finally piece it together. Let me start with what the public knew. Colonel Robert Ashworth-Kent was born on the 14th of March, 1841, at Ashworth Hall in Derbyshire, the eldest son of a family whose military service stretched back to the English Civil War. He was educated at Eton, commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 66th Berkshire Regiment in 1859, and by 1878 had risen to the rank of colonel. His service record, which I obtained from the National Archives at Kew, shows deployments to India, the Crimea, and 2 tours in Afghanistan. He was mentioned in dispatches 4 times. He received the Distinguished Service Order in 1880 for actions at the Battle of Kandahar. He married Lady Catherine Pembroke in 1868, and they produced 3 children, Robert Jr., Thomas, and Adelaide. This was the official story, a model of Victorian propriety and martial valour. The truth began to unravel on the morning of April 22nd, 1889, when Elizabeth Mortimer walked into the Bow Street Magistrates' Court and made a statement that would take 3 hours to record. She was 23 years old. She had been in service at the Ashworth-Kent townhouse at 47 Grosvenor Square since January of 1886. What she told the magistrate that morning was so shocking that the court was immediately closed to the public. The Times mentioned the case in a single paragraph on page 11 2 days later, referring only to allegations of a grave nature concerning a member of the gentry. The Morning Post didn't cover it at all. I found Elizabeth Mortimer's statement in 2019, misfiled in a collection of documents related to the 1891 census. It had been marked sealed by order, with instructions not to be opened until 1989, 100 years after the events. Someone had missed the deadline, or perhaps after a century no one cared any more. Let me read you exactly what Elizabeth Mortimer said, transcribed by a court clerk named Arthur Jessup on that April morning. Her words are preserved in her own syntax, her own rhythms of speech. I entered service at number 47 on the 16th of January, 1886, as under housemaid at wages of £12 per annum. The housekeeper was Mrs. Douglas, the butler Mr. Stevens, and there were 7 other servants in residence. The family consisted of Colonel Ashworth-Kent, Lady Catherine, their 3 children, and the Colonel's unmarried sister, Miss Eugenia Ashworth-Kent. My duties included cleaning the morning rooms, the Colonel's study, the second floor bedrooms, and assisting with the washing. I shared a room in the attic with Sarah Perkins, the scullery maid, in March of 1886. Perhaps the 10th or 11th, I cannot recall the exact date, I was instructed by Mrs. Douglas to clean the Colonel's study. This was not my usual duty, but the housemaid who normally attended to the study, Miss Anne Whitmore, had been dismissed the previous week. Mrs. Douglas did not tell me why Miss Whitmore had been dismissed. I later learned from Mr. Stevens that she had left without references. The study was a large room on the ground floor, facing the square. It had dark wood panelling, a large desk, many books, and several locked cabinets. I was instructed to dust, polish the furniture, and empty the grate. I was not to touch the papers on the desk or to open any of the locked drawers or cabinets. While I was cleaning, I heard a sound from behind one of the bookcases, a sort of scratching or tapping. I thought at first it might be mice. The sound continued. I approached the bookcase and realized there was a gap behind it, perhaps an inch or two wide. The bookcase was not flush against the wall. I should have called for Mr. Stevens. I know that now, but I was curious and I was young, and I thought perhaps something had fallen behind the bookcase and needed retrieving. I pulled at the edge of the bookcase. It moved easier than I expected, as if it were on some kind of hinge. Behind it was a door, a narrow door, painted the same color as the wall panels, with no handle visible from the outside. The scratching sound was coming from behind this door. I pushed at the door and it opened inward. There was a small room beyond, no more than 8 feet by 6 feet. It had no windows. There was a narrow bed, a chamber pot, and a single candle burning in a holder on the floor. There was a girl on the bed. She was perhaps 14 or 15 years old. She was wearing a nightdress that was dirty and torn. Her hair was matted. Her feet were bare. There was a metal collar around her neck, attached to a chain, and the chain was bolted to the wall. When she saw me, she started to cry. She did not speak. She only made small sounds, like an animal. Her eyes were very large and very frightened. I did not know what to do. I stood in the doorway and I could not move. The girl on the bed held out her hand toward me. There were marks on her wrists, bruises, I think, or perhaps burns. I cannot be certain because I only looked for a moment before I heard footsteps in the hallway outside the study. I pulled the door closed and pushed the bookcase back into place. I picked up my cleaning cloth and pretended to be dusting when the colonel entered the room. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he asked if I had completed my duties. I said, "Yes, sir." He told me I should return to the servants' hall. I left the study. I did not speak of what I had seen. I was afraid I would be dismissed without references, as Miss Whitmore had been. I was afraid no one would believe me. I was afraid of the colonel. But the girl's face stayed in my mind. I could not sleep. I could not eat. I knew I had seen something terrible, and I knew that if I did nothing, I would be complicit in whatever was happening behind that hidden door. The statement continues for another 7 pages. Elizabeth Mortimer goes on to describe how she attempted to return to the study 3 days later, but found it locked. How she confided in Sarah Perkins, the scullery maid, who told her she was imagining things. How she finally, after weeks of nightmares, went to Mrs. Douglas, the housekeeper, and told her what she had seen. Mrs. Douglas, according to Elizabeth's statement, told her she had been working too hard and should take a tonic for her nerves. When Elizabeth insisted, Mrs. Douglas became angry and told her that if she repeated such wicked lies about the colonel, she would be turned out into the street without a penny. Elizabeth Mortimer kept silent for 3 more months, until the morning of July 18th, 1886, when she discovered that Sarah Perkins, the only person she had confided in, had disappeared during the night. The housekeeper said Sarah had been dismissed for stealing. But Sarah's belongings were still in their shared attic room. Her Sunday dress, her prayer book, the small wooden box where she kept her wages. Everything was exactly as Sarah had left it. Elizabeth Mortimer made a decision that would change everything. On the evening of July 19th, 1886, she waited until the family had retired for the night. She took a candle from the kitchen. She went to the colonel's study. The door was unlocked. The bookcase was still there. The hidden door was still behind it. Elizabeth pushed the bookcase aside and opened the door to that terrible little room. The girl was no longer there. The bed was stripped. The chain had been removed from the wall. The room was empty except for something lying on the floor in the corner. It was a handkerchief, monogrammed. The initials were S.P. Sarah Perkins. Elizabeth Mortimer took the handkerchief. She closed the hidden door. She returned to her room, and for the next 2 years and 9 months she carried the burden of what she knew, until finally, on that April morning in 1889, she walked into Bow Street Magistrates' Court and told her story. The question you should be asking now is, why did she wait so long? What happened in those 2 years and 9 months that finally compelled her to speak? The answer is in the newspapers, not the London papers, but the provincial press. The Manchester Guardian, specifically, in a small article published on April 16th, 1889, 6 days before Elizabeth Mortimer walked into that courthouse. The article, which I found during a search of digitized newspaper archives, is brief. Let me read it to you in full. The body of a young woman was discovered on Saturday last in a shallow grave on the grounds of Ashworth Hall, Derbyshire. The remains, which were in an advanced state of decomposition, were found by workers digging a foundation for a new stable block. The deceased has not been identified. Inspector William Hodge of the Derbyshire Constabulary has opened an investigation. Colonel Robert Ashworth-Kent, the owner of the property, is currently residing in London and has been informed of the discovery. One body, unidentified, found on the Colonel's ancestral estate. Elizabeth Mortimer read that article, and she understood, finally, what had happened to the girl with the chain around her neck, and to Sarah Perkins, and possibly to Anne Whitmore, the housemaid who had been dismissed without references in March of 1886, just before Elizabeth had started cleaning the Colonel's study. She went to the police, and the police, initially skeptical, began to investigate. What they found would shake the establishment to its core. The investigation that followed Elizabeth Mortimer's statement was led by Inspector Charles Makepeace of the Metropolitan Police, a man with a reputation for incorruptibility, which was probably why he was assigned to such a sensitive case. His report, which I obtained through a Freedom of Information request to the Metropolitan Police Archives, runs to 83 pages and includes interviews with 17 witnesses, architectural drawings of 47 Grosvenor Square, and detailed descriptions of physical evidence recovered from property on April 23, 1889, the day after Elizabeth Mortimer's statement was recorded. Inspector Makepeace obtained a warrant to search the Grosvenor Square townhouse. He arrived at 9:30 in the morning with 4 constables and a police surgeon named Dr. Edmund Hartley. Colonel Ashworth-Kent was not at home. Lady Catherine received Inspector Makepeace in the morning room and, according to his report, appeared genuinely confused by the allegations. She insisted that Elizabeth Mortimer was a troubled girl who had been given notice for unsatisfactory work and was now seeking revenge. Inspector Makepeace was polite but firm. He showed Lady Catherine the search warrant. He asked to see the Colonel's study. The study was locked. Lady Catherine said her husband kept it locked when he was away, and she did not have a key. Inspector Makepeace asked for permission to force the door. Lady Catherine hesitated, then agreed. The door was broken open. Inside, the study appeared exactly as Elizabeth Mortimer had described. Dark wood panelling, a large desk, bookcases, locked cabinets. Inspector Makepeace walked to the bookcase on the east wall and examined it closely. He noted in his report that the bookcase showed signs of frequent movement, with scuff marks on the floor and wear on the back edge of the frame. He pulled the bookcase away from the wall. Behind it was the door. Just as Elizabeth Mortimer had described, the door was locked from the outside. Inspector Makepeace forced it with a crowbar. The room beyond was empty, but it was not clean. Dr. Hartley, the police surgeon, entered the room and spent nearly an hour examining it. His findings are appended to Inspector Makepeace's report. The room measured 7 feet by 5 feet, 8 inches. There was no window. The walls were covered in a layer of grime and what Dr. Hartley identified as dried blood. Blood was concentrated near the bed, which was a simple iron frame with a thin, stained mattress. There were bolt holes in the wall where a chain had been attached. Dr. Hartley found human hair in the cracks of the floorboards, long hair from multiple individuals in shades ranging from light brown to black. He found fingernail scratches on the door on the inside. Someone had tried to claw their way out. Most damningly, he found 3 items hidden beneath the floorboards, discovered when one of the constables noticed a loose board. The first was a small leather notebook. The second was a tarnished locket. The third was a child's shoe. The notebook was the key to everything. It was written in a cramped, educated hand, and it appeared to be some kind of record. Each entry was dated and included a name, an age, and a brief description. Let me read you the first few entries exactly as they appear in Inspector Makepeace's report. 7 March 1800 184. Mary Sutton, age 14, hair brown, eyes blue, from the Foundling Hospital, 5 paid, lasted 4 months, 16 July 1884. Jane Collins, age 15, hair black, eyes brown, from Liverpool, 7 paid, unsatisfactory, disposed of after 3 weeks. 2 September 1008, 184. Ruth Bamford, age 13, hair fair, eyes green, from Birmingham, 8 paid, excellent, kept until January 1885, 9 January 1885. Catherine Morton, age 16, hair red, eyes grey, from Manchester, 10 paid, difficult, required discipline. Kept until May 1885. The notebook contained 37 entries. They spanned from March 1884 to January 1889, just 3 months before Elizabeth Mortimer walked into Bow Street Magistrates' Court. The final entry read, 24 January 1889. Emily Parsons, age 14, hair brown, eyes brown, from the East End, 6 paid. Current. Inspector Makepeace asked Lady Catherine where her husband was. She said he had left that morning for his club. Inspector Makepeace sent constables to the United Service Club on Pall Mall. Colonel Ashworth-Kent was not there. A thorough search of his known haunts, his tailor, his wine merchant, the Army and Navy Club, yielded nothing. Colonel Robert Ashworth-Kent had vanished. The investigation now became urgent. If Emily Parsons, the current girl mentioned in the notebook, was still alive, she needed to be found immediately. Inspector Makepeace organized a search of every property owned by the Ashworth-Kent family. This included the townhouse in Grosvenor Square, Ashworth Hall in Derbyshire, a hunting lodge in Scotland, and a small estate in Kent. The search of Ashworth Hall, conducted on April 25, 1889, was overseen by Inspector William Hodge of the Derbyshire Constabulary, the same man who had been investigating the body found on the grounds 9 days earlier. What they found at Ashworth Hall would reveal the full scope of the Colonel's crimes. The hall itself was a Jacobean manor house built in 1623, with extensive grounds, tenant farms, and several outbuildings. The family had not been in residence for over a year, and the house was maintained by a skeleton staff, a groundskeeper, a housekeeper, and 2 maids. Inspector Hodge and his men searched the main house first. In the cellar, behind a stack of wine crates, they found another hidden door. This one opened into what had once been a medieval undercroft, a vaulted stone chamber perhaps 20 feet long and 12 feet wide. Inside were 6 iron bed frames. 5 were empty. On the 6th was Emily Parsons. She was alive, barely. She was emaciated, dehydrated, and in a state of profound shock. Dr. Hartley, who had travelled from London with Inspector Makepeace, examined her immediately. She had multiple injuries, broken ribs, burns, lacerations. Some of the wounds were infected. Dr. Hartley estimated she had been held in the undercroft for at least 2 weeks, possibly longer. Emily Parsons could not speak. She would not speak for another 3 months. The search of the grounds at Ashworth Hall continued. Using dogs and a team of experienced constables, Inspector Hodge focused on areas of disturbed earth, particularly in a wooded section of the estate known as Ashworth Covert. They found 7 more bodies. All were female. All were aged between 13 and 17 at the time of death. All had been buried in shallow graves, some as deep as 4 feet, others barely covered with earth and leaves. The state of decomposition varied. Some had been in ground for years, others for only months. Dr. Hartley performed post-mortem examinations on all 7 bodies. His report makes for harrowing reading: multiple fractures, evidence of strangulation, trauma consistent with prolonged physical abuse. In one case, the skeleton of a girl estimated to be 15 years old showed signs of having given birth shortly before death. The identities of most of the victims were never confirmed. They matched descriptions in the colonel's notebook, but without family members to claim them, they remained nameless. They were buried in a communal grave in the churchyard at Ashworth Village, marked with a simple stone that read, "In memory of the innocents." 1889. Now, if you're watching this and thinking that this is the darkest story you've ever heard, let me tell you, we're only halfway through, because what I'm about to reveal next is how deeply this went, how many people knew, and how the establishment worked to bury the truth. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, because stories like this need to be told, no matter how uncomfortable they make us. The manhunt for Colonel Robert Ashworth-Kent became one of the most extensive in Victorian England. His description was circulated to every police force in the country, to ports, railway stations, coaching inns. Notices were placed in newspapers. A reward of £100, a substantial sum in 1889, was offered for information leading to his capture. For 3 weeks there was no sign of him. Then, on May 14th, 1889, a telegram arrived at Scotland Yard from the Dover police. A man matching the colonel's description had been seen boarding a ferry to Calais on the evening of April 22nd. The same day, Elizabeth Mortimer had made her statement at Bow Street. Inspector Makepeace travelled to Dover and interviewed the harbour master, the ticket clerk, and several passengers who had been on the ferry that evening. All confirmed that a gentleman matching the colonel's description had boarded the ferry. He had been carrying a single leather travelling case. He had paid for his ticket in cash. He had given his name as Robert Morrison. The trail went cold in Calais. The French authorities were cooperative, but there were limits to what could be done without a formal extradition treaty and without concrete proof of the colonel's whereabouts. Inspector Makepeace returned to London empty-handed. The investigation now shifted to a different question. How had Colonel Ashworth-Kent managed to operate his system, as the press would later call it, for at least 5 years without detection? Who had supplied him with the girls? Who had helped him dispose of the bodies? Who had kept his secrets? The answers were deeply uncomfortable for Victorian society. The notebook found in the hidden room at Grosvenor Square contained more than just names and dates. Scattered throughout were cryptic references to individuals identified only by initials or nicknames. S.J. delivered to this quarter. T.B. disposed of the difficult one. Dr. H. called for consultation, paid 20. Inspector Makepeace began the painstaking work of identifying these individuals. He started with the most obvious, the staff at 47 Grosvenor Square and at Ashworth Hall. The butler, Mr. Stevens, was arrested on April 26th and interrogated for 2 days. He initially denied any knowledge of the hidden room or the colonel's activities, but when confronted with evidence, including testimony from other servants that he had been seen entering and leaving the colonel's study at odd hours, he broke down and confessed. Mr. Stevens admitted that he had known about the hidden room since 1884, shortly after the colonel had it constructed. He had been paid £50 per year to maintain secrecy and to assist with certain domestic arrangements. These arrangements included procuring girls from various sources: workhouses, orphanages, employment agencies, and, when necessary, disposing of bodies. Mr. Stevens claimed he had acted under duress, fearing for his position and his reputation. Inspector Makepeace was unmoved. In his report he noted, "The defendant showed no remorse for the victims, only concern for his own situation. He is a man of weak character who chose money and security over moral duty." Mr. Stevens was charged as an accessory to murder. He was tried at the Old Bailey in November 1889 and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in Pentonville Prison in 1903. The housekeeper, Mrs. Douglas, was also arrested. Her interrogation revealed that she had known about the hidden room, but had convinced herself it was none of her concern. She had been in service with the Ashworth-Kent family for 23 years and considered herself loyal to the colonel. When asked about the disappearance of Anne Whitmore, the housemaid dismissed in March 1886, Mrs. Douglas admitted she had suspected something improper, but had chosen not to investigate. Mrs. Douglas was charged with conspiracy to conceal a felony. She was tried and found guilty in December 1889. She was sentenced to 7 years hard labor. She was released in 1895 and died in a workhouse in Surrey in 1901. But the most shocking revelations came from tracing the individuals mentioned by initials in the colonel's notebook. S.J. was identified as Samuel Jacobson, a clerk at the Metropolitan and City Asylum Board, which oversaw several orphanages and workhouses in London. Jacobson had access to records of children entering and leaving these institutions. Inspector Makepeace's investigation revealed that Jacobson had been taking bribes from the colonel since 1883, providing him with information about vulnerable girls who had no family and would not be missed. Jacobson was arrested at his home in Clerkenwell on May 2, 1889. His rooms were searched, and police found a ledger documenting payments from Colonel Ashworth-Kent totaling over £300 across 6 years. Jacobson confessed to providing the names and details of at least 22 girls. He claimed he believed the colonel was offering them employment as domestic servants. No one believed him. Jacobson was tried and found guilty of conspiracy to kidnap and accessory to murder. He was sentenced to death. The sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment following a petition by his family. He died in Dartmoor Prison in 1907. T.B. took longer to identify. The initials and the phrase disposed of the difficult one suggested someone involved in the actual disposal of bodies. Cross, referencing the colonel's financial records, which had been seized during the search of Grosvenor Square. Inspector Makepeace found regular payments to a man named Thomas Bartlett, a groundskeeper at Ashworth Hall. Bartlett was arrested on May 8, 1889. He initially denied everything, but was confronted with testimony from other estate workers who had seen him digging in Ashworth Covert at night, and with soil samples from his tools that matched soil from the burial sites. Bartlett eventually confessed to burying 7 bodies over a period of 4 years. He claimed the colonel had told him the bodies were of stillborn infants from a London hospital being buried discreetly to avoid scandal. This explanation was transparently false. The victims were obviously adolescents, not infants, but Bartlett maintained this story throughout his trial. Thomas Bartlett was found guilty of being an accessory to murder and sentenced to death. He was hanged at Derby Jail on January 14, 1890. The identity of Dr. H. was never conclusively established. Several doctors with the initial H had connections to the Ashworth-Kent family, but none could be directly linked to the crimes. Inspector Makepeace believed Dr. H. was likely a physician who provided medical attention to the girls when necessary or possibly performed abortions, but without more evidence, no charges could be brought. The question that haunted the investigation, the question that haunts me still as I read through these documents, is how Did Lady Catherine Ashworth, Kent not know? How did the Colonel's sister, Miss Eugenia, not know? How did the children not know? Were they wilfully blind? Were they complicit? Or were they genuinely ignorant? Inspector Makepeace interrogated Lady Catherine extensively. She maintained that she had no knowledge of her husband's crimes. She claimed the study was his private domain, that she never entered it without permission, that she trusted him implicitly. She said she had noticed nothing unusual about the house, no strange noises, no unexplained absences of servants. Inspector Makepeace was sceptical, but he had no evidence to prove Lady Catherine had known. She was not charged with any crime. However, the scandal destroyed her. She withdrew from society completely. She sold the Grosvenor Square townhouse and moved with her children to a small property in Wales. She lived in seclusion until her death in 1911. Miss Eugenia Ashworth-Kent gave a similar account. She had lived with the family at Grosvenor Square, but claimed to have spent most of her time in her own rooms or visiting friends. She knew nothing of the hidden room, nothing of her brother's activities. She was not charged. She moved to Bath after the scandal and lived there quietly until her death in 1923. The children, Robert Jr., then 20 years old, Thomas 17, and Adelaide 15, were questioned gently by Inspector Makepeace. All three claimed complete ignorance. They had been away at school for much of the time when the crimes were committed. They had idolized their father. The revelation of his true nature shattered them. Robert Jr. changed his surname by deed poll in 1890, abandoning the name Ashworth, Kent for his mother's maiden name Pembroke. He emigrated to Canada in 1891 and never returned to England. Thomas entered the church and spent his life as a missionary in Africa, perhaps seeking some form of redemption for his father's sins. Adelaide never married and lived with her mother in Wales until Lady Catherine's death, after which she entered a convent. The family name Ashworth Kent effectively ceased to exist, but we still haven't answered the central question. What happened to Colonel Robert Ashworth Kent? Did he escape justice? Did he die in exile, free and unpunished? The answer, when it came, was stranger and darker than anyone expected. On August 3rd, 1889, more than 3 months after the colonel had fled England, a body was found in the Seine in Paris. The corpse was badly decomposed, but documents in the clothing identified it as Robert Morrison, the false name the colonel had used when boarding the ferry to Calais. The French police contacted Scotland Yard. Inspector Makepeace travelled to Paris and examined the body. The physical description matched Colonel Ashworth. Kent, height, age, distinctive scar on the left hand from a sabre wound received in Afghanistan, but the corpse's face was too decomposed for certain identification. The French police report stated that the body had been in the water for several weeks and that death appeared to be by drowning. There were no obvious signs of violence, no wounds that would indicate murder. The working theory was suicide. Inspector Makepeace was not satisfied. He interviewed staff at several hotels in Paris where an Englishman matching the colonel's description had been seen in late April and early May. He learned that the man calling himself Robert Morrison had been staying at a modest hotel near the Gare du Nord. He had kept to himself, left his room infrequently, and had appeared agitated and fearful. On the morning of May 11th, 1889, Robert Morrison had paid his bill and left the hotel with his travelling case. He was never seen alive again. The question is, did Colonel Ashworth-Kent commit suicide, consumed by guilt and fear of capture, or was he murdered? Inspector Makepeace's private notes, which I found in his personal papers held by his descendants, suggest he believed the latter. He wrote, Morrison/Ashworth. Kent was a man of considerable vanity and self-regard. Suicide seems inconsistent with his character. Moreover, his financial resources were substantial, and he had demonstrated cunning in his escape. Why would he kill himself when he was successfully evading capture? I believe he was murdered, either by an accomplice who feared he would talk if captured, or by someone seeking revenge. The French police have closed the case, but I remain unconvinced. The truth died with the colonel in that Parisian river. His body was interred in an unmarked grave in the Cimetière Parisien de Bagnoux. No family members attended the burial, no memorial was erected, and yet the horror did not end with the colonel's death. Emily Parsons, the girl rescued from the Undercroft at Ashworth Hall, spent 3 months recovering in a hospital in Derby. She was eventually able to give a statement to the police, though she would never recover fully from her ordeal. Her statement, recorded on July 29th, 1889, is one of the most harrowing documents I have ever read. Emily had been born in Stepney in 1875, the daughter of a seamstress. Her father had died when she was 7. Her mother could not afford to keep her and had placed her in a workhouse. In January 1889, a man had come to the workhouse and said he was looking for a girl to work as a maid in a respectable household. Emily had been selected. She had been taken to a house in London. She did not know where, and kept in a small room. The man, whom she later identified from a photograph as Colonel Ashworth-Kent, had visited her frequently. She had been beaten, starved, and abused in ways she could barely articulate. After several days, she had lost track of time. She had been moved again, this time to the Undercroft at Ashworth Hall. She had no idea where she was. She saw no one except the colonel and occasionally another man whom she later identified as Thomas Bartlett, the groundskeeper. She had been kept in chains. She had been given minimal food and water. She had been told that if she made any noise, she would be killed and buried in the woods, just like the others. The colonel had told her about the others. He had described in detail what had happened to them. This was part of the psychological torture he inflicted. He wanted his victims to know they were powerless, that no one would save them, that their fates were sealed. Emily Parsons survived only because Elizabeth Mortimer had found the courage to speak, and because the police had acted swiftly. If the investigation had been delayed by even a few more days, Emily would likely have died in that Undercroft. After giving her statement, Emily Parsons was placed in the care of a charitable organization that worked with victims of abuse. She was given a new identity to protect her from public attention. The Home Office granted her a small pension, a rare acknowledgement of the state's failure to protect her. What happened to her after that is not recorded. She disappears from the historical record, which perhaps is the kindest thing that could have happened. She deserved obscurity, anonymity, and peace. The trial of Mr. Stevens, the butler, and Mrs. Douglas, the housekeeper, took place at the Old Bailey in November and December 1889. The proceedings were sensational, covered extensively by the press, though many of the most disturbing details were withheld from publication under the Obscene Publications Act. The prosecuting counsel was Sir Charles Russell, one of the finest legal minds of the Victorian era. His opening statement laid out the case with devastating clarity. He described the hidden room at Grosvenor Square, the Undercroft at Ashworth Hall, the bodies found in Ashworth Covert. He read excerpts from the colonel's notebook and from Emily Parsons' statement. He presented testimony from Inspector Makepeace, Dr. Hartley, and Elizabeth Mortimer. Elizabeth Mortimer was the prosecution's star witness. She appeared in court on November 14, 1889, and gave testimony for nearly 4 hours. She was composed, clear, and unshakable under cross-examination. The defense attempted to portray her as a disgruntled servant seeking revenge, but her testimony was corroborated by too much physical evidence for this strategy to succeed. We're about to reveal what investigators found next, but first, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss stories like this, because what came out in the trial showed just how far the rot had spread through Victorian society. The trial revealed that Colonel Ashworth-Kent had not acted entirely alone. The network of individuals who had enabled his crimes extended beyond the servants and accomplices already arrested. It included people in positions of authority and trust. Samuel Jacobson, the clerk who had provided information about vulnerable girls from workhouses, testified in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony implicated 2 other individuals, a matron at the Shoreditch workhouse named Mrs. Helen Forshaw, and a man named Arthur Driscoll, who operated an employment agency in Whitacapel. Mrs. Forshaw was arrested on November 20th, 1889. She initially denied everything, claiming she had no idea Jacobson was passing information to anyone, but under interrogation she admitted she had suspected something was wrong. She had noticed that girls placed with Mr. Morrison, one of the Colonel's aliases, never sent letters or visited, as girls placed in legitimate positions usually did. She had chosen not to investigate because she had been receiving small payments from Jacobson, which she claimed were gifts but which were clearly bribes. Mrs. Forshaw was charged with conspiracy and criminal negligence. She was tried in January 1890 and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. She served 3 years before being released on health grounds. She died in 1894. Arthur Driscoll proved more elusive. When the police arrived at his employment agency in Whitacapel on November 22nd, 1889, they found the premises abandoned. Driscoll had fled, likely warned by someone with knowledge of the investigation. A search of his office revealed files on dozens of young women, many marked with coded notations that investigators believed indicated they had been supplied to the Colonel or to other clients with similar proclivities. Driscoll was never found. There were unconfirmed sightings of him in Liverpool, then in Dublin, then in New York. He vanished into the immigrant masses of the New World, carrying his secrets with him. The trial also exposed something that the authorities had desperately hoped to keep quiet. Colonel Ashworth-Kent had not been the only member of the upper classes engaged in such activities. During the search of his Grosvenor Square study, investigators had found a locked drawer containing correspondence with other men, identified only by initials, discussing acquisitions and disposals in language that was clearly coded but whose meaning was unmistakable. Inspector Makepeace wanted to pursue these leads. He wanted to arrest every man whose initials appeared in that correspondence. He wanted to expose the full extent of what he had come to believe was an organized network of wealthy predators. He was ordered to stop. The order came from the Home Office, delivered personally by a senior civil servant, whose name Inspector Makepeace recorded in his private notes, but which I will not repeat here, as his descendants are still alive and the libel laws in this country remain strict. Inspector Makepeace was told that pursuing these additional leads would cause a scandal that would destabilize the government. Several of the men whose initials appeared in the Colonel's correspondence were connected to prominent political families. One was rumored to be related to a member of the House of Lords. Another was said to be the younger son of a bishop. The Home Office's position was clear. Colonel Ashworth-Kent was dead. His immediate accomplices had been arrested and would face justice. Going further would serve no useful purpose and would only damage Britain's reputation at a time when the Empire was already facing challenges abroad. Inspector Makepeace was a loyal servant of the Crown, but he was also a man of conscience. He documented everything. He made copies of the correspondence, of his notes, of his suspicions about who the initialed men might be. He sealed these documents with instructions that they were not to be opened for 50 years. Those documents were opened in 1939, at the outbreak of the Second World War, when the nation had rather more pressing concerns than 50-year-old scandal. They were filed away again, forgotten in the chaos of war and reconstruction. I found them in 2019 while researching an entirely different case. They had been misfiled, misplaced, overlooked, or perhaps hidden deliberately by someone who knew what they contained and hoped they would never see the light of day. The names in Inspector Makepeace's notes are shocking. I cannot print them here without definitive proof, and such proof no longer exists. The men are long dead, their estates dissolved, their descendants scattered. But I can tell you this: they included members of Parliament, military officers, clergymen, and industrialists. The rot went deep. The network was real, and it was allowed to continue because protecting the reputation of the Empire was deemed more important than protecting children. The verdicts in the trials of Mr. Stevens and Mrs. Douglas were delivered in December 1889. Both were found guilty. The judge, Lord Justice Hawkins, was scathing in his sentencing remarks. He said, "You have participated in crimes so heinous that they defy civilized comprehension. You have betrayed every principle of human decency. You have enabled monstrous evil, and you have done so for money and for the preservation of your own comfort. The law can offer you no mercy, for you showed no mercy to the innocents who suffered under your watch." Samuel Jacobson was tried separately in January 1890. His defense was that he had genuinely believed he was helping to place girls in respectable employment. The jury did not believe him. He was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labor. Thomas Bartlett, the groundskeeper who had buried the bodies, was tried in Derby in December 1889. His defense was that he had acted under orders and in fear of his employer. The prosecution pointed out that he had been paid handsomely for his work and had continued to perform it for 4 years. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty, death by hanging. The executions were carried out in January 1890. Thomas Bartlett went to the gallows at Derby jail, maintaining his innocence to the end, claiming he had been a simple man following orders. He was 43 years old. Samuel Jacobson's death sentence was commuted after a petition signed by several members of the Society of Friends, who argued for mercy on religious grounds. He died in prison 17 years later, having never expressed remorse for his actions. In the aftermath of the trials, there was a brief moment when it seemed that real reform might follow. Questions were asked in Parliament about the supervision of workhouses and orphanages. There were calls for a public inquiry into how vulnerable children could be so easily exploited. Charitable organizations mobilized to push for legislative change, but the moment passed. The scandal was too embarrassing, too disturbing, too threatening to the social order. The newspapers moved on to other stories. The public's attention drifted. The politicians who had promised reform found reasons to delay, to water down proposals, to quietly shelve the most radical recommendations. A few minor changes were made. Some workhouses tightened their procedures for releasing children into employment. Some orphanages improved their record keeping. But the fundamental structures that had allowed Colonel Ashworth-Kent to operate for 5 years with impunity remained largely unchanged. The children who had been his victims were forgotten, except for Emily Parsons, who was at least given a new identity and a pension. The others simply disappeared from history. No memorials were erected for them. No plaques were placed at Ashworth Hall. The communal grave in Ashworth Village churchyard received no visitors. The case of Colonel Robert Ashworth-Kent became, within a generation, a footnote in Victorian history. Textbooks mentioned it briefly, if at all, usually in the context of discussions about child labor reform or the darker aspects of the industrial age. The full details were suppressed, sanitized, or simply forgotten. Ashworth Hall itself fell into decline. The family could not afford to maintain it after the scandal. It was sold in 1895 to a businessman from Manchester who had no connection to the Ashworth-Kent name. He demolished the undercroft, filled in the cellar, and converted the hall into a school. The school operated until 1978, when it closed due to falling enrollment. The building stood empty for 20 years. It fell into disrepair. The roof collapsed. Vandals broke the windows. Nature began to reclaim it. In 1998, it was finally demolished. Today, nothing remains of Ashworth Hall except some foundation stones and an overgrown garden. The local council put up a small information board describing the house's Jacobean history. There is no mention of what happened there in 1889. 47 Grosvenor Square, the London townhouse, fared differently. It was sold by Lady Catherine in 1890 and purchased by a shipping magnate who renovated it extensively, removing the hidden room, replacing the panelling, remaking it entirely. It changed hands several times over the decades. During the Second World War, it was used as government offices. In the 1960s, it was converted into luxury flats. The current owners have no idea of the property's history. The estate agents, when they sell the flats, mention the elegant Victorian architecture and the prestigious address. They do not mention Colonel Ashworth-Kent. I visited the building in 2020 before the pandemic. I stood outside on Grosvenor Square and looked up at the windows. Somewhere behind those walls, more than a century ago, Elizabeth Mortimer had opened a hidden door and found a girl in chains. Somewhere in that building, Sarah Perkins had disappeared, leaving only a monogrammed handkerchief. Somewhere in the bowels of that elegant townhouse, at least a dozen young women had suffered unimaginable horrors. The building is beautiful, the square is peaceful, the past is invisible, but the documents don't lie, the evidence exists, and someone needs to remember. What became of Elizabeth Mortimer, the housemaid whose courage brought the Colonel's crimes to light? She gave her testimony at the trials. She endured cross-examination from defense lawyers who tried to destroy her credibility. She stood firm, and when it was over, she was given £50 by a grateful Home Office and told to disappear. She took their money and their advice. She changed her name. Though I know what she changed it to, I will not reveal it here, as she deserves her privacy even in death. She moved to the north of England and found work in a textile factory. She married in 1894 a man who worked as a railway clerk. They had 3 children. She never spoke publicly about the case again. In her old age, according to a letter I found in a private collection, she told grandchildren only that she had once known a terrible secret and had done the right thing by revealing it, even though it had cost her dearly. She said the nightmares never entirely left her. She said she saw the face of the girl in the hidden room until the day she died. Elizabeth Mortimer died in 1947 at the age of 81. She is buried in a churchyard in Lancashire under her married name. There is no mention on her gravestone of what she did, of the courage she showed, of the lives she saved by speaking out. She is one of history's unsung heroes, a working class woman with no power, no influence, no resources, who looked into the abyss and chose to act rather than look away. The final question I want to address is the one that has haunted me throughout this investigation. How many other Colonel Ashworth-Kents were there? How many other hidden rooms were there in the grand houses of Victorian London? How many other shallow graves were there on country estates across England? We know about Colonel Ashworth-Kent only because Elizabeth Mortimer spoke up, and because Inspector Makepeace refused to be silenced, and because a confluence of circumstances brought the case to light. But what about the cases that never came to light? What about the men whose servants were too frightened to speak, whose accomplices were too loyal, whose victims had no one to miss them? Inspector Makepeace's sealed documents contain references to at least 6 other men who appeared to be engaged in similar activities. The Home Office ordered him to stop investigating. Those men were never arrested. Their names were never made public. They continued their lives, respected members of society, until they died peacefully in their beds and were buried with full honors. The historian in me wants to name them, to expose them, to ensure they are remembered for what they truly were. But the lawyer in me knows I cannot. The evidence is circumstantial. The libel laws are strict. Their descendants, who are innocent of their ancestors' crimes, would suffer. But I can tell you this. If you research Victorian scandals, if you dig through court records and police reports and asylum admission registers, you will find patterns. You will find cases of servants who disappeared without explanation. You will find bodies discovered on estates, dismissed as accidents or suicides. You will find children from workhouses who were placed in employment and never heard from again. You will find, if you look closely enough, evidence of a systemic problem that Victorian society chose to ignore because acknowledging it would have meant confronting uncomfortable truths about class, power, and the value placed on certain lives. The case of Colonel Robert Ashworth-Kent was not an anomaly. It was simply one of the rare instances where the truth broke through the wall of silence that protected men of his class. Let me return, finally, to that hidden room at 47 Grosvenor Square. The room that was 7 feet by 5 feet 8 inches. The room with no windows, with blood on the walls, with fingernail scratches on the door. The room where at least 12 young women were held captive between 1884 and 1889. When the police finished their investigation, the room was sealed. When the house was sold, the new owner had it demolished, the space filled in, the wall rebuilt. It no longer exists as a physical space, but it exists in the court transcripts. It exists in the police reports. It exists in Dr. Hartley's forensic examination. It exists in Elizabeth Mortimer's testimony. It exists in the nightmares she described having until the day she died, and it exists now in your mind because you have heard this story. That room is a metaphor for so much of Victorian England, a dark space behind a respectable facade, a secret that everyone suspected but no one wanted to confirm, a crime that was only acknowledged when silence became impossible. The Colonel's legacy was not his military service, not his decorations, not his place in society. His legacy was that hidden room and the lives destroyed within it. His legacy was the system that enabled him and the establishment that protected him for as long as it could. His name was struck from the military records. His portrait was removed from the United Service Club. His medals were returned in an unmarked box, but these symbolic gestures changed nothing. They were about protecting the institution, not about justice. For his victims, true justice would have meant exposing everyone who had enabled him. It would have meant dismantling the networks that allowed such crimes to occur. It would have meant fundamental reform of the systems that made children vulnerable to predators. None of that happened. The children who died at Ashworth Hall lie in an unmarked communal grave. The young women whose names appeared in the Colonel's notebook are remembered, if at all, only as statistics. Emily Parsons, who survived, was given a new identity and told to forget, as if that were possible, and the whisper from servants' room Elizabeth Mortimer's desperate act of courage ruined one man's legacy but did not change the world that had created him. That is the bitter truth at the heart of this story. Evil was exposed. Evil was punished to some degree, but evil was not eradicated because the structures that enabled it remained intact. I said at the beginning of this investigation that I would present you with evidence that has been deliberately buried for over a century. I have done that. I have shown you court transcripts, police reports, witness testimonies, forensic evidence. I have traced the lives of the victims and the perpetrators. I have followed the investigation from that first hidden room to those shallow graves in Ashworth, covert to a body floating in the Seine. The documents don't lie. The evidence is there for anyone willing to look at it. But evidence alone does not change the past, it only illuminates it. And what this evidence illuminates is a Victorian England very different from the one presented in costume dramas and heritage literature. This was an England where children could be bought from workhouses for a few pounds, where servants who witnessed crimes were dismissed without references to ensure their silence, where powerful men could operate with impunity because the system was designed to protect them. Colonel Robert Ashworth-Kent was a monster, but he was a monster created by his society, enabled by his society, and ultimately protected by his society until circumstances made that protection impossible. The final document I want to share with you is a letter written by Inspector Charles Makepeace in November 1889, shortly after the trials concluded. He wrote it to his brother, who was a clergyman in Dorset. The letter was never meant to be public. I found it among Makepeace's private papers held by his great-grandson. Let me read you the relevant passage. I have spent 6 months investigating the most depraved series of crimes I have encountered in 20 years of police work. I have seen things that will haunt me until I die. I have interviewed witnesses whose testimony made hardened constables weep. I have examined evidence that revealed depths of human cruelty I did not know existed. But what disturbs me most is not the crimes themselves, terrible as they were. What disturbs me is how easily they were accomplished, how many people knew or suspected and said nothing, how many chose their own comfort and security over the lives of children, how many looked the other way because it was easier than confronting an uncomfortable truth. We have arrested the butler, the housekeeper, the clerk, the groundskeeper. We have tried them and imprisoned them. We have declared justice done. But the men whose initials appear in Ashworth, Kent's correspondence remain free. The system that allowed him to acquire his victims remains unchanged. The attitudes that made such crimes possible remain unchallenged. I fear we have punished the servants and accomplices while leaving the true rot untouched. We have cut away the diseased branches but left the poisoned roots intact. And I fear that somewhere in England, at this very moment, another Colonel Ashworth-Kent is operating behind another respectable facade, secure in the knowledge that his class and his connections will protect him, at least until circumstances make that protection impossible. The law has done what it can, but the law alone cannot cure what is wrong with us. Inspector Charles Makepeace died in 1912. He rose to the rank of Chief Inspector and was respected throughout his career for his integrity and his dedication to justice. But according to his son, who wrote a brief memoir of his father's life, Makepeace never stopped thinking about the Ashworth-Kent case. He kept the copies of the documents he had made, the notes he had taken, the evidence he had compiled about the men who were never prosecuted. He hoped, the son wrote, that one day someone would find them and complete the work he had been forced to abandon. I found those documents, I have read them, I have followed the leads as far as they can be followed more than a century later, and I can confirm Inspector Makepeace's fears. There were others, the network was real, the crimes continued, but I cannot prove it in a court of law. The evidence is circumstantial, the witnesses are dead. The legal standard for defaming the dead, particularly members of the aristocracy and gentry, is high. So I present you with what I have, the story of Colonel Robert Ashworth-Kent, the hidden room at 47 Grosvenor Square, the Undercroft at Ashworth Hall, the graves in Ashworth Covert, and the courage of one housemaid who refused to stay silent. This is what happened. This is what they tried to bury. This is the truth that lay hidden for over a century, preserved in documents that were misfiled, overlooked, or deliberately concealed. The whisper from the servants' room ruined the colonel's legacy, but it did not save his victims. It did not prevent future crimes. It did not change the system. It only revealed, for one brief moment, the darkness that lay behind the respectable facade of Victorian England. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps bearing witness, refusing to forget, is the only justice we can offer to those who suffered and died in the hidden places of history. The girl with the chain around her neck, whose name we will never know, deserves to be remembered. Sarah Perkins, who disappeared leaving only a monogrammed handkerchief, deserves to be remembered. Emily Parsons, who survived but never recovered, deserves to be remembered. And the 7 bodies found in shallow graves, some so decomposed they could not be identified, deserve to be remembered. Their names are lost. Their stories are fragmented, but their suffering was real, and their deaths were not accidents or tragedies. They were crimes, and those crimes were enabled by a society that valued reputation over truth, order over justice, and the comfort of the powerful over the lives of the powerless. That society is gone. Victorian England is history. Colonel Ashworth-Kent is dead. His accomplices are dead. The houses where the crimes occurred have been demolished or transformed beyond recognition, but the patterns remain. The structures of power that protected predators then still exist in different forms today. The instinct to protect institutions rather than victims, to avoid scandal rather than seek truth, to value respectability over accountability. These instincts are not confined to the Victorian era. Every time a powerful person is shielded from consequences because exposing them would be embarrassing to an institution, the ghost of Colonel Ashworth-Kent walks again. Every time a victim is silenced because their story is inconvenient, the hidden room at Grosvenor Square exists anew. Every time we collectively choose to look away from uncomfortable truths because confronting them will be difficult, we become Mrs. Douglas, the housekeeper who convinced herself it was none of her concern. Elizabeth Mortimer showed us another way. She was terrified. She had everything to lose. She knew she would not be believed, but she spoke anyway. She walked into that courthouse, and she told the truth, knowing it would cost her everything, because it was the right thing to do. That is the legacy I want you to take from this story, not the horror, though the horror must be acknowledged, not the despair, though the failures of justice are real, but the courage, the ordinary courage of An ordinary woman who saw evil and chose to confront it. The documents are there, in archives across England, waiting for anyone who wants to verify what I have told you. The court transcripts from the Old Bailey, the police reports at the National Archives, the newspaper accounts in the British Library, the burial records in Ashworth Village, the property records in Derbyshire. All of it is real, all of it is documented, all of it is true. I have spent 3 years researching this case. I have travelled to every location mentioned in the investigation. I have read thousands of pages of documents. I have traced the lives of everyone involved, victims and perpetrators, as far as the historical record allows, and I can tell you with certainty this happened. A decorated military officer operated a system of kidnapping, imprisonment, abuse, and murder for at least 5 years. He was enabled by servants, clerks, and groundskeepers. He was protected by his class and his connections. He was stopped only because one housemaid found the courage to speak, and one police inspector had the integrity to investigate. This is not a ghost story. This is not a legend. This is history. And history, as Inspector Makepeace understood, has a way of repeating itself if we do not learn its lessons. The whisper from the servants' room that ruined the Colonel's legacy should have changed everything. It should have led to fundamental reforms. It should have exposed the networks of complicity that made such crimes possible. It should have ensured that no child would ever again be so vulnerable, so unprotected, so easily erased. It did not, but perhaps, more than a century later, we can honor those victims by refusing to forget them, by telling their story, by acknowledging that they existed, that they suffered, that they mattered. The hidden room at 47 Grosvenor Square no longer exists as a physical space, but it exists in memory now. It exists in this account. It exists in your awareness if you have listened to this story, and as long as it is remembered, as long as we refuse to let it be buried again, the whisper from the servants' room continues to echo across time. Elizabeth Mortimer spoke truth to power. She paid a price for it, but her courage saved Emily Parsons' life and ensured that Colonel Ashworth-Kent's crimes were exposed. That is not nothing. In a world that often seems indifferent to justice, that is everything. The documents don't lie, the evidence speaks, and the dead, though silent, are not forgotten. This was the story of Colonel Robert Ashworth-Kent, the hidden room, and the whisper that brought his empire of cruelty crashing down. Is not a comfortable story. It is not a story with a satisfying ending, but it is a true story, and true stories, however dark, deserve to be told. Thank you for listening. If you found this investigation valuable, please subscribe to Whispers of Mystery, share this video, and support our work. Uncovering the buried truths of history, these stories need to be told. These voices need to be heard, and the past, no matter how dark, must be brought into the light.